podcast.
Boneless Comics Podcast.
We like
Comics?
Comics Big.
because they have no balls.
I'm Joe Getcho.
And I'm Mike White. And this is We Like Comics Because They Have No Bones.
Yes, it is, and yes, we do. Or no, we don't. What would be the proper response to that? I don't know, but here we are.
I don't know. I confuse myself sometimes.
Yeah,
But what I'm not confused about is where you can find us on social media, which is at Boneless Comics Podcast on Instagram and Facebook, and at Boneless Comics 1 on Twitter.
Yes, you should definitely find us at all of those places. And also on our YouTube channel for videos, after shows, bonus content, and Spidey Joe's one-shots at tinyurl.com/Boneless Comics Podcast.
Yeah. And again, the YouTube channel has some really good content, so everybody go check that out if you get some free time. Joe gets a chance to deep dive on some characters that we haven't really had a chance to review a full story on, so that's kind of a fun thing to go seek out if you're looking for more. But today, we're going to be covering the Ms. Marvel Civil War tie-in from 2016, written by G. Willow Wilson, with artists Adrian Alfona, who only did issue 7 and flashbacks in the story, Takeshi Miyazawa, who did issues 8 through 11, and Mirka Andolfo for issue 12.
Yes, this is written by G. Willow Wilson, or Gwendolyn Willow Wilson, and I don't really know why she would want to abbreviate such a cool name like Gwendolyn, but she did. So G. Willow Wilson is the writer for our story today, and is actually only 4 days younger than Mike here.
Wow.
But unlike Mike, she grew up in the state of New Jersey, which also happens to be the state where Ms. Marvel is based. So G. Willow Wilson's first exposure to comics was actually reading an anti-smoking pamphlet featuring the X-Men, and then also watching the 90s X-Men animated series. So kind of similar to us, growing up watching the animated series of the 90s and all the superheroes out there, but she was primarily fixated on the X-Men. But she got a career in writing that actually began as a freelance music critic, and then later wrote a graphic novel for Vertigo in 2007. So from there, that launched her writing for DC Comics. She wrote fill-in issues 704 and 706 of Superman, a 5-issue miniseries Vixen Return of the Lion, and also wrote issue number 4 of Outsiders 5 of a Kind, which featured Metamorpho and Aquaman.
Nice.
And more recently, she wrote for Wonder Woman in 2018-2019, and has recently written Poison Ivy number 1, published on June 7th, 2022. So only a week before this recording.
Yeah, and where I'm aware of her from is Wonder Woman, because I wasn't able to get a hold of those issues, but I read them in the DC Universe Infinite app. So I actually went through most of her run because it was dealing with some continuity stuff that I was interested in at the time during the Rebirth era.
Yeah, it seems like she's had a pretty good career.
Mm-hmm.
She also has worked for Marvel, well, obviously, because we're talking about Ms. Marvel here, but she started by writing on a relaunched book called Mystic in a 4-issue limited series in 2011, which I hadn't heard of before, but from the notes I found online, she described it as a high fantasy Mean Girls meets Les Miserables.
Wow.
So, kind of hard to picture. But
yeah, I was going to say that's a little hard to picture.
yeah. So check that out, I guess, if that sounds interesting to you. But anyway, she also worked on a couple of books called Girl Comics and Women of Marvel before receiving an email from the senior vice president in Marvel Entertainment to co-create a new version of Ms. Marvel named Kamala Khan alongside Sana Amanat, a director and editor at Marvel Entertainment whose list of credits include Captain Marvel, Ultimate Spider-Man, All New Hawkeye, Daredevil, Elektra, Rocket Raccoon, and of course, Ms. Marvel. So she got a call from the bigwigs, hey, let's create a character, and of course she said yes, and here we are today. So in a TED Talk, Amanat said the big idea behind Ms. Marvel was very much about minority representation. The bigger idea was about finding your authentic self. While creating the comic, she drew on her own experiences as the child of Pakistani immigrants in the New Jersey suburbs in hopes that the next generation would not experience identity rejection as she did through a relatable superhero. And G. Willow Wilson, back to her real quick, she's also written 3 novels, received a ton of awards and nominations for her work. And if you remember from the beginning, I said that she got into comics by watching X-Men. Well, she actually got to write for the X-Men on X-Men Volume 5, The Burning World in 2015. So I bet that was pretty awesome.
It's sort of surreal that these people that grew up watching the same cartoons as us are now the professional comic book writers that are like working
Yes.
in the industry. So it's always interesting when you hear like, oh, they started where I did, something like
And
that.
now they're launching like characters that are known, the world over and have won, many awards and nominations and
Yeah,
should have went
it's
into writing.
I know, that's what we should have done. So the pencilers on this book are Adrian Alfona, Takeshi Miyazawa, and Mirka Andolfo. We do have three pencilers here, but I'm really going to focus on Takeshi Miyazawa because he did most of the work. Adrian Alfona is kind of interesting, though, because he worked in comics in the mid 2000s and then actually exited the industry entirely, but then came back and eventually began working for Marvel again during like the early to mid 2010s. So just kind of an interesting, he seems like somebody that has kind of a lukewarm relationship with the industry. But Miyazawa is a Canadian artist that began with a title at Dark Horse entitled Empowered Special 9 Beers with Ninjette before he moved to almost
Okay.
exclusively work for Marvel Comics. So I don't think he's worked with any other publishers professionally besides those two. He did work on a ton of titles that are very much in your wheelhouse, though, Joe, because he wrote Mary Jane Homecoming, Miss Marvel, Runaways, Spider-Gwen, and Silk, as well as some fill-in issues on Uncanny X-Men and Spider-Man Unlimited. And his art incorporates a manga influence into the more cartoony, less over-muscled style that we usually see in American comics. So it's kind of a fusion. It leans a little bit more towards a Japanese-looking style, though.
Yeah, kind of that like loose cartoony style.
Mm-hmm.
I did sort of recognize it because especially the way Kamala's face was drawn and like when her mouth was open for some reason that was the one that stuck in
Mm-hmm.
my mind as really similar to a lot of the issues I read of Silk where he was the artist and it was like the same sort of look like similarly I guess being like young females that's just kind of his drawing style but
Sure.
yeah, it's definitely that like kind of cartoony. It's a little too cartoony for me. Like the first style from Adrian Alfona looked super cartoony, and then I think Miyazawa's was like it was cartoonish, but it was I maybe I'm used to it now and it doesn't bother me as much. But I'm not really a fan of the like super cartoony look. But the last artist actually, Andolfo, was my favorite because it was a lot sharper and everybody looked a lot more like actual characters than
Mm-hmm.
like cartoon. I mean, it's not
they
like a
didn't they didn't have a
cartoon.
case of same face as much, which
Yeah,
is
that
which
too.
is something that artists definitely get into in comics. Unfortunately, because of the way their deadlines work, honestly, a lot of them do have a shorthand. Like I know David Finch, who we've talked about before, he really only has one female face that he draws. But I mean, if you ask him about it, he's basically just like, I've got to hit the deadline. I don't have time to research and use photo reference for a whole bunch of different women to get a bunch of different women characters to look different in the face. So, which I mean, kind of makes sense,
Especially
but
if they're in the background.
exactly. Yeah, but I really didn't care for Alfona's art in the first issue, so I'm with you on that. It was cartoony, but it almost had like a sketchiness or almost like an unfinished look to it,
Yeah.
almost like the inks hadn't been laid down in a way that really tightened it up, and they just inked over the pencil lines directly, which an inker can really change how an image looks depending on what they decide to keep and what they decide to lose from the pencils. So I think that was a lot better balanced when we got to Miyazawa's art, and it looked a lot tighter. And then yeah, the last issue especially, it looked more like this is a superhero comic, kind of look. But overall, I liked Miyazawa's stuff. It was really just the first issue that put me off.
Yeah, and I think also comparing the first issue to the subsequent issues, it's always noticeable when you're reading a storyline where, with multiple issues and you have different artists between issues, like you're reading the story and you're like, "Oh, get to the next issue, see what's next." And then everybody looks different, like they're in the same it's kind of like when you take a summer break from a TV show and then you come back and like some of the actors have changed their hair and they look a little bit older and they got a tan over the summer but
The
they
haircuts are always the thing. If you like watching Star Trek Voyager,
Oh yeah.
Recently, I've been rewatching that, and like every time they have a season break, it's completely obvious. Everyone comes back with a new hairstyle. Everybody looks a little bit different, and it's like, whoa! It's jarring when you're just going from one episode to another.
Yeah, that's
So,
definitely a thing in comics too.
so I guess a little bit of background on who Miss Marvel, Kamala Khan is. She is a Pakistani American girl. I think she's about 16. That's at least the kind of the vibe that I get from the comic book. She's still in high school, and she kind of struggles with where she fits in the world. She's not sure she really fits in with her parents or with the superhero community exactly, but she idolizes Captain Marvel, Carol Danvers. And so it's really her goal to, work with her. And at this point in Miss Marvel's history, she's gotten to a point where she is, if not an active member of the Avengers, she's at least friendly with Captain Marvel. So they are, working together some. So I think that's really all the background that you need on Kamala. Her family's Muslim, and a lot of the sort of Pakistani culture are very much a part of the book. And it also has a different feeling just because it's set in Jersey City, New Jersey, which is not New York, thankfully, because the joke
Yeah.
about Marvel is always, what if something goes wrong and you're not in New York, because that's where all the superheroes are. So it was kind of cool to be like, oh, we're actually outside of New York, even though it's like just across the river from it, I think.
Yeah. The other thing about Kamala Khan, I think that's worth mentioning is that she's totally a fangirl.
Mm-hmm.
And her origin story is really cool if you get into it because, and I won't go into too many details, but she's a teenager while the Avengers are around and she sees all these superheroes everywhere and she's so excited by them. She's a fan of them. Captain Marvel is, like her idol.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially she gets to join them and become a superhero with them. So it's like, every child's dream come true where you're like, oh, I want to be, with this crowd. Well, not crowd, like social group, but like, oh, I want to be an astronaut or I want to be a scientist or I want to be, whatever. And then you actually get to do that at a young age. Like that's where Kamala is coming from is she's a fangirl who was looking from the outside in and now she's, essentially a member of the team or maybe a junior member, I should say.
Right. And the way she gets her powers are basically there's something called Terrigen Mist that is released upon the earth, and that unlocks her dormant inhuman cells. And that's honestly something that's not super important here, and we can get into it in the after show. But it is worth noting that that's very different from what they do with the Disney Plus show. But she gets kind of I guess they call it polymorphing abilities. It's a lot like Reed Richards or Mr. Fantastic in that she can stretch, but she tends to make herself bigger or smaller as well, which is something that you don't see Mr. Fantastic do so much. And when she's fighting, her fist or her foot will get a lot bigger as she's, impacting a bad guy or something like that. So that seems to be how she uses her powers for the most part.
Yeah. And then she'll use the word embiggen. And it's not like Shazam where she has to say it to activate something. There's actually a team up with Spider-Man where she sort of reveals like, well, she says that all the time, but she's not required to. It's more just kind of something fun to say.
It's a catchphrase.
Yeah. So I'm, a huge Captain Marvel fan, and I've read a lot of the old Ms. Marvel stuff when it was Carol Danvers, and I really haven't
Mhm.
read a lot of Ms. Marvel once, Carol shifted to calling herself Captain Marvel in the pseudoconic runs. But so I've like been aware of Kamala sort of in the background or as a supporting character or as a team up, but I haven't really read anything of hers that was like a solo book. But with the Avengers game that came out a couple of years ago, and then of course the Disney Plus show, it seemed like a good time for us to review one of her books. And well, you'll see what we thought at the end, but she's definitely a really fun character, and she's kind of like sometimes been compared to a young Peter Parker, where we have this kid who's in high school and they have to deal with the drama of being in high school, but also dealing with having a secret identity as a superhero.
Mhm. So I guess my background with the character is I was just kind of aware of her on the peripheral. I wasn't really reading Marvel actively at the time because I was in my, oh, they canceled the Fantastic Four period where I wasn't really reading Marvel stuff at that time. But I was aware of her because my little sister actually picked up her book just on a whim and got into it. And she said that this is actually a character that she really identifies with, as far as, sort of dealing with family expectation versus who she is, and like feeling like they love her but also feeling like, I don't fit, and that kind of thing. And so a lot of it was relatable stuff for her. So that's really all I knew coming into this, besides that and her powers. So it's been good to actually dig into a story, that just focuses on Kamala, because I
Mhm.
really haven't done that. I was aware that she was on a superhero team. I think that's after this book ends, called The Challengers, with the Amadeus Cho Hulk, who's like a younger Hulk character, and Kid Nova, and I believe Miles Morales is on that team as well. And maybe one of the Vision kids. I think it's like kind of a Teen Titans or something like that at DC. It's got kind of a similar vibe to that. So I was aware that she was in there, but I've never read any of it. So oh, I guess I should say the Miss Marvel that I did know was Sharon Ventura during her time on the Fantastic Four. She's a really tragic character, and honestly not related to this one at all, so we don't really need to get into that. But yeah, there have been a lot of characters named Miss Marvel over the years. Even Valeria Richards at one point in Fantastic Four was going by Miss Marvel.
Yep.
So
If you want to hear more about the various iterations of Miss Marvel, tune in for our after show.
yeah.
But for now, this story that we're reading today is actually what's called a tie in to a larger storyline that was going on at the time that affected the entire Marvel comic book universe called Civil War II. And this is actually the second Civil War event. The first one was 2006 to 2007, and this one is very different, but it's the same premise of you have heroes on opposing sides fighting each other, kind of like in the Captain America Civil War movie in the MCU, where you have some sort of disagreement between the heroes and they choose sides of, well, we think this is the right way, well, we think this is the right way, and a clash results.
Right. The conflict is pretty well based around, there's a kid named Ulysses, about the same age as Kamala, and he is also hit with this mist that turns him into an inhuman, but he gains the ability to, he's basically like a precog or a clairvoyant or something like that. He can sort of forecast the future and see like events that are going to happen. And so the core conflict in this story is between Iron Man, Tony Stark, and Captain Marvel, Carol Danvers, where they're really fighting over what to do with Ulysses, where Tony Stark is arguing, I don't think we should use him to predict the future. This is too dangerous. It violates due process and all that stuff. And Carol's like, if we can prevent atrocities before they happen, that's what we should be doing. So that's really sort of the core problem that they're facing, or the moral dilemma that they're fighting about. And for my money, maybe a little bit better of an issue for them to deal with or dig into than what they did in the first Civil War event.
Yeah, it really seemed like we were making a huge deal out of this in order to pit everybody against each other. Whereas this issue is a lot more like, well, they're both right. I mean, this is
Mm-hmm.
something that's very dangerous, but also something that could be very helpful in stopping crime before it happens. But, obviously you
Mm-hmm.
can take it too far and it becomes a problem, but which side do you choose? And so that's sort of where Ms. Marvel comes into play. Is she's not really on the forefront of that decision or that activity, but she does get called by Captain Marvel to sort of head up a little team of vetted volunteers, as she says, of people who are going to go and sort of enforce the pre-crime aspect of, anybody that Ulysses says is going to commit a crime. This group of kind of young people who's led by a 16-year-old girl who's not been a superhero for very long are going to make sure that they stay within the confines of the law, but try to prevent crime before it happens. So, what could go wrong?
Right. I think another of Iron Man's concerns was just that Ulysses would be controlled by somebody that didn't have altruistic motives as well, which is obviously a concern. What they probably should have done, honestly, was just leave him with the Inhumans. I think they could have handled teaching him about his powers and all that stuff a little bit better than kind of pulling him out and using him for all these missions. But that's neither here nor there. But that's really the backdrop for this story. And so the conflict does escalate to a violent point between Iron Man and Carol during this story. And I believe during Civil War II, James Rhodes actually gets killed as well, which
Yes.
didn't stick for very long. It was like 3 years or something like that. But that was sort of given as the impetus for Iron Man to really become polarized about it.
Well, it did the same thing to Carol as well, because she and Rhodey were actually dating at the time. Like they had
okay.
a romantic storyline going on, and so he gets killed, and Carol blames Stark, and Stark blames her, and so there's this, in addition to the not seeing eye to eye on Ulysses' front, now they're blaming each other for what happened to Rhodey, and so it gets complicated fast.
So, what's interesting to me, honestly, is that you chose an event tie-in for this character, and I don't know how much thought you put into that. Normally, that's not where I would go if I'm trying to introduce an audience to a new character. However, having read this story, I feel almost like this is a defining moment in Kamala Khan's history, and so that to me made me think, maybe that's why Joe picked this one. You know,
So
so.
the real reason why I originally picked this is because I was looking at local comic book stores, and I found a bargain bin where they had stuff marked down super low, and I saw a Ms. Marvel team up with Spider-Man and with Captain Marvel that looked really cool. But then I also saw the Civil War II tie-in. And I have Civil War II, I think I have a Spider-Man tie-in, and I don't know, just something about it looked interesting. And then I saw like Nova and Miles Morales on the back cover, and I was like, oh,
Mhm.
maybe it's a team up book. So sure, for a couple dollars, I'll give it a shot. And that was originally why I really picked it. But I also, for the purposes of this podcast, I don't think we need to review every single origin story that's out there,
No,
especially
that's
for
true.
characters that are well known. Sometimes it's nice to just pick up a story and be like, okay, this is a character development moment for a certain character, and we can kind of discuss the origin as we go. So
Mhm.
I was kind of a being cheap reason why I originally picked it, but I think it was a good choice to sort of see her on her own, sort of making decisions, but then also see the amount of character growth that she gets from this story as well.
Yeah, this to me is a big character growth story for Kamala. And so that's something that we can get into more at the end, but in this book, the way that Kamala Khan fits into this, it starts out with a science fair where her friend Bruno has an experiment that goes wrong and there's a big explosion and you see a lot of kids doing science projects that look like,
Way too advanced.
yeah, something like Elon Musk would come up with, or something like that. Like you get the impression that these kids could be going into space by themselves without any parental help or something like that. So that was pretty interesting, but it very quickly dovetails into the Civil War storyline where Carol Danvers calls Miss Marvel aboard the Alpha Flight space station and she's like, "Hey, we're going to send you on a mission. We're going to put you in charge of it. I trust you now. You're going to be the one spearheading these missions to arrest criminals before they can commit crimes." And so to me, not a great decision to put a 16-year-old in charge of this
No.
necessarily, but that's what Carol does.
That seemed really strange to me. Like, this is a huge deal. Like, they're
Yeah.
not exactly operating. I mean, they're supposed to try to stay within the confines of the law, but you can't. How do you prevent something that hasn't happened yet and stay in the confines of the law? Like, you have to quarantine people past, whenever it was that they were going to do
Mhm.
something. Maybe have some, I don't know, counseling to deal with whatever issues that what are causing them to want to
Yeah.
commit some kind of criminal act. I mean, this is a big, complex thing that they're trying to do here. And a 16-year-old girl and a bunch of volunteers who seem kind of questionable doesn't seem like the best way to impose this, but maybe it's just for Jersey City. So she was doing like a trial run in a not New York place in order to see how it goes.
Yeah, I don't know, but at any rate, after that decision is made, they go on several missions, they kidnap several people and are locking them up without a trial, which again, we're getting more and more problematic with the situation. And it eventually escalates to a point where one of Kamala's friends, was it Bruno? Was that the
No, it
one?
was a guy named Josh.
Yeah, okay, one of her friends, Josh, pings on Ulysses' radar and they're going to go lock him up. And at that point, Kamala starts to question if they're doing the right thing. And she ultimately ends up switching her position on this issue towards the end of the story. So it's really about her discovering where her moral line is, but also her discovering that maybe she's not exactly the same as the people that she idolizes, and kind of figuring out how to think for herself and what sort of mark she wants to leave on the world. So those are very much the themes of this story.
Yeah, and really through the conflict that she has in here, she ends up with, like her best friend tries to tell her from the beginning that she's on the wrong side, but she doesn't listen.
Mm-hmm.
And, she wants to please Carol because, she's her mentor, but eventually establishes her independence and says, "No, Carol, I think you're wrong." And she calls in Iron Man for backup. And so, Carol's like super upset, disappointed. Basically, not that she owns Kamala, but she disowns her and is like, "Okay, I'm out of here." And she disappears. And her friend Bruno is like, he tries to rescue Josh, and so he gets hospitalized. And then when he comes to, he's
Mm-hmm.
like, "I don't want to have anything to do with you, Kamala. I told you from the beginning you were on the wrong side, and now, I'm in the hospital because of it. I'm going to have to learn how to walk again." And so her friend and mentor are backing away from her, and she's sort of left on her own. And it actually takes a trip to Pakistan for her to realize, because she doesn't fit in there either, because everybody pegs her as an American right away.
Right.
So she goes and she actually dresses up in like kind of native garb to hide her identity to go on like a Miss Marvel mission. And when she does that, she gets a scolding from a local superhero named Red Dagger, because she jumps into this situation and starts busting up the bad guys. But he says the situation's complicated. They've got these water tanks that they're stealing. They're actually local heroes to some people, so you have to be careful. And so she's just like bumping back and forth of like, okay, I don't fit here. I don't fit here. But this is where I think Kamala shines as a character, where she doesn't let this get her down. In the end, she realizes that, you know what? I can't abandon Jersey City because, it's like I'm in the city and the city's in me, and we're together in this. So, regardless of what's happening or what people are doing, I have, great power comes great responsibility, basically, to, go back to the city and just live her life the best that she can and protect the city as best that she can. So she kind of ends with this positive outlook and is going to return to Jersey City to, continue the next chapter. So
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely feels like a complete story.
I think some of the previous reviews that we've done have sort of been snippets out of time that go unresolved, but this is a nice one.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's an effect of it being an event tie-in where they sort of need to tie it up in a neat bow at the end because it's part of the event, and then, some new storyline will start at the end once you go
Mm-hmm.
back to her solo series. But I don't know, it's kind of neat.
This, as event tie-ins go, also felt like it was motivated by Kamala Khan's character as opposed to being motivated by the narrative that they had to tell.
True.
And that was kind of a big deal to me. So it did not feel forced. Very often event tie-ins do.
Yeah.
So this was a very good, kind of a best case scenario for event tie-in book.
Yeah, it doesn't happen very often. Usually the event takes over and whatever you were reading is gone. And I
Right.
think we've talked about this in a previous episode. So
Yeah. The only thing I think about it being an event tie-in that was a little bit lost on me was there was some kind of world building in the first issue at the science fair where we like meet her supporting cast, but I didn't really catch everybody's name. I think there's Josh and Zoe and Bruno and then maybe one other friend that she has, but they didn't all make an impression on me just because I'm not familiar with Kamala and who her high school friends are. So
Mhm.
I did feel a little bit lost at first, but they started to feature Bruno a little bit more and Josh a little bit more, and those were really the two friends that they focused on the most. And the rest of it I was able to pick up from context. So not a big deal, but I did feel a little bit lost coming in cold.
Yeah, the first issue was interesting because it almost seemed, I don't want to say out of place in that it shouldn't have been there, but it seemed like it was just a, preamble to getting to the main story that was unrelated. But it was
Right.
actually really neat to see not only the heroes, but see them out of costume in their secret identities, and also see some of their sidekicks. Like Miles' sidekick was there, Genki, and I don't
Oh,
know if Nova has a sidekick or not.
I don't think so.
No. So,
Not not I mean Nova, the Nova that we see in this story basically would be the sidekick, I would think.
okay.
Almost. So, because that's Sam Alexander, he's like the younger version of that character. So with Richard Rider being the older one.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah,
yeah.
so that was neat to see their interactions between each other and sort of like the spying on their projects. Like Kamala goes to spy on Miles, and his spider sense alerts him that he's being spied on because she's like super tiny. She shrinks herself down and she runs and hides, and then she runs away when he catches her, and then he jumps out of the shadows, with his stealth and surprises her, and it's just like kind of like kids playing, and it's a fun little scene that happens, and I kind of wish we got more of it before they started bringing out the wacky inventions and the one at the end that like exploded and caused a scene. Like I wondered if that was going to be some sort of catalyst for civil war of like somebody blew up a high school science fair or something. But
Yeah, like because he made a miniature fusion reactor. In fact, they were all doing things that were what Kamala's team was making
it's like a shark in a bubble.
a sustainable environment for sharks outside of the ocean. I'm not sure how that's useful, but it was pretty scary.
It was, yeah, and really
There's just
strange.
a
It's like
shark like floating, right?
like a giant bubble around him, like and his environment goes with him, but it's just like floating, and they have this little stick or string or something to sort of move him around the science fair. Like, how do you choose with all these inventions? They're all like
I don't know.
super advanced level. But speaking of the interactions, there's one where they sort of like, because they're using their powers, but sort of nonchalantly, they still don't really know their identities per se, all the way across the board. So there's this comment that I think Kamala makes where she says, "You learn not to see things your friends aren't ready for you to see." Because I think it's Nova who shows up and he's like, "Oh, hey, I was, nearby. How did you guys get here so quick?" And they're like, moving on. Let's help people."
Yeah, that was really interesting observation. You learn not to see the things your friends aren't ready for you to see, because I think that's relatable even if you're not a superhero. Because, oftentimes, I don't know if you've ever been talking to somebody and they may let something slip by accident, or maybe they have a problem going on with them but they're not ready to talk about it yet. They may, some of that may spill out accidentally, and then you have to kind of just choose to let it go,
Hmm.
and not
Not pry.
exactly, not pry into it. So I thought that was really interesting. I don't know if that was supposed to foreshadow like what happens with Josh's girlfriend later in the story, because he's trying to impress her for like the whole story, that with how smart he is, because she's always telling him he's dumb, and then later she's like, well, actually I'm a lesbian, so sorry I was so mean to you, it has nothing to do with your intelligence, but I'm not going to date you anymore. So I didn't know if like that line was maybe supposed to foreshadow that reveal a little bit or what, but it was interesting certainly that not necessarily all of them know their identities and their, or maybe they do, or they suspect, but they're not going to come out and say like, yes, Miss Marvel is Kamala Khan, or Miles is Spider-Man,
Yeah, they're going to respect their secret identities because, like
Mhm.
if I reveal yours, you're going to reveal mine. So let's all keep each other's
Right.
secrets for our own
That's
best interest.
That's something that in the Teen Titans, in particularly like the New 52 run by Scott Lobdell, everybody on the Teen Titans pretty much revealed their identities to one another except Tim Drake, who was like, "Yeah, I'm not going to tell you guys who I am." And like everybody's just kind of annoyed by it. They're like, "Why can't we know your real name? We know everybody else's." And he's like, "Because that's not like safe, and you guys shouldn't have done that." Basically, I mean, that's kind of where he's
Yeah.
coming from. So
That sounds like something Peter Parker would do because, usually it's also like, he keeps his identity secret to protect the ones that he loves because, if anybody's
right.
had a rough life of their family members getting attacked, it's definitely Peter Parker. So
Yeah.
it's that same sort of thing where, if everybody's revealing their identities, he's going to keep his a secret, more so to protect other people. So that's why, like, in the MCU, he just unmasks and he's like, no, look, see, I'm a person. My name's Peter Parker. Oh, are we using our imaginary names? I'm like, no, he unmasked way too quickly there. Mm-mm.
Yeah, it was a very big deal whenever his identity became public in the comics, Peter Parker. And then
Yeah.
that actually was during Civil War One.
Mm-hmm.
And then they put the genie back in the bottle later so that people don't know who he is anymore.
Thank goodness.
So, which is funny because that's kind of what they did with Spider-Man No Way Home as well.
Yeah,
They
true.
sort of put his identity back in the bottle as a secret. So definitely some comic parallels and stuff they've done in movies.
Yeah, I feel a lot better
But,
about that. Like, it makes me nervous when I see his identity being revealed.
Right.
Like, oh.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the people around him tend to pay whenever that
Yeah.
happens. But the story after the science fair, it moved into a little vignette where Kamala's, I think it was either her mother or her grandmother, and I wasn't exactly clear who, but she was talking about a little bit about the history of Pakistan and when the British left and the sort of unstable political climate and then sort of why they decided to come to the United States to escape from that environment. And I thought that was really interesting, and especially because that I don't really know anything about Pakistani history. So that was kind of revealing to me as far as like, okay, this is where this family is coming from. They're immigrants. They, don't necessarily feel like they fit in the United States, but it's safer there than where they were living. And I really like the line at the end of that where her mother says, sometimes there is very little hope, but there is never no hope. So kind of a foreshadowing for really how Kamala was going to have to overcome the events of this story too.
Yeah,
So,
I think that was definitely world building, and it was really surprising for an event tie-in because usually you're so focused on the event. But they had her, I don't know, what is it, her bracer or whatever that belonged to her grandmother, I think. They
yeah.
showed that in sort of the flashbacks, and then they showed it again in modern day. And I haven't gone ahead to look to see what the storyline is after this, but I have a feeling that they were sort of sowing some seeds there for something that was going to go on with, related to her family history and that particular artifact in later issues. So be interesting to see where that thread is unraveled later.
Yeah. It was definitely good to get into that because it just gave me a lot better cultural understanding of where Kamala was and how she felt about living in Jersey City.
Yeah.
So
Speaking of culture, there were also a lot of pop culture references in this, and some that I don't know if they were references or they were parodies or they were, just something strange that they made up, and some that were, definitely like the tween mutant samurai turtles and the shirt that Bruno was wearing that said 1.21 gigawatts or gigawatts if you go by Doc Brown's pronunciation. But there were a couple others like the Canadian Ninja Syndicate, and then they get together and they do this Toronto hardstyle maple leaf formation, which
that was hilarious. So what was better than the fact that they did a maple leaf style formation with their ninjas was that they had a tank that they stole, a Canadian super tank that has eyes and they're like missiles on the front that look like teeth, and then there's a maple leaf painted on the top. And also, what was the other one? They said, oh, somebody called her Judge Dredd Barbie.
Oh yeah.
Or I can't remember if they called Kamala that or one of the other girls that was with her. But that was hilarious. And I was thinking, do these kids really know who Judge Dredd is? Is that a little bit of a dated reference for them? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think the remake was that popular that, all the kids would be raving about it. So
no, no. So that felt a little out of place, but it was funny. It was enjoyable for me to see.
Yeah.
So.
In the scene in Pakistan when she goes to visit there at the end, the truck that the criminals are driving says like Gabbar Singh is my co-pilot. So I looked this up, and this is an actual historic, well, not, I wouldn't say historic figure, but it's an actual person who was a criminal, and there was like a ransom for his capture or, dead or alive, bring his head, blah, blah, blah. So
I can bring you in warm, or I can bring you in cold.
I, I
Wow.
I'm not sure again if that was just because of Pakistani culture that they decided to reference that, but it was also hilarious because, he's my co-pilot. Like the criminals really advertised that on the side.
Right.
Well, they were just as crazy as the Canadian Ninja Syndicate.
Yeah, they were pretty over the top for sure.
That made the story more fun though.
Yeah, it did. It did. So all the references lent this story. Honestly, it's funny because the subject matter of this story is pretty heavy, but the tone of it is not that heavy because Kamala is, kind of a fun character and we've got all these fun references and stuff. And I think even then when they do get serious, those scenes almost have more weight because it was so jokey for a lot of it, particularly at the beginning. So that was actually something I liked about it. I felt like they balanced the humor and the drama pretty well.
Yeah, especially for Kamala sort of being a more positive character. Like she's not really one, doesn't seem like she's one to be like down in the dumps or take things too seriously, or if she does, she sort of bounces back quick, kind of like we see at the end. But
Right.
speaking of like her and the heavy narrative, like so we talked about earlier that Carol puts Kamala in charge of this group of vetted volunteers, and Kamala kind of jokes like, "Oh, are these the Carol cadets?" Because there's a Carol Corps, so these
Yeah.
kids would be like the Carol cadets. But it's like we were talking about the reasons for why Carol would do this. Is it just because like of a small time operation that it's like a trial run, or was there some sort of like career move there for Kamala, or was it Carol just dousing a flame with a wet blanket just to throw something at it to get them to stop? We need support from the Avengers, we need this, we need that. Okay, fine, here, look, here's a hero to lead you, now get out of my face. Like what do you think the reason really was for Carol doing this?
This kind of stuck in my craw a little bit because it almost felt like Carol was aware that Kamala idolized her and it almost felt manipulative, like she was like using that to be like, "Oh, well, I know she'll be on my side because she idolizes me." And
Hmm.
it almost feels like Kamala's too young to be making the decisions that affect these criminals like before they commit crimes. It seems like somebody with more experience should be overseeing that. I feel like Carol should have overseen this directly if she was really that committed to the idea. And I kind of felt like it damaged her character a little bit to put Kamala in charge. Like I don't know. Like that kind of rubbed me the wrong way a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of like I need people who I can trust for these roles, so I'm going to pick you because I know that you're going to align with me just based on our mentorship, friendship, that sort of thing. And
Right.
Kamala kind of does at first, but then she brings, even she brings up the point of like, well, isn't this kind of like profiling? And Carol, immediately jumps on it. No, this is totally different. Profiling is bad science. It targets communities and families, whereas what we're doing here targets a specific individual who already has the intent to commit some sort of crime. So she defends it, and Kamala kind of goes along with it. But it seems like when Kamala really gets to thinking about it, she's like, you know what? I don't agree with you. And in fact, I actually need to stand up to you, even though you're my mentor, and tell you that I think you're wrong. And
Right.
maybe that was the reason why, was because so we could have this moment of her, standing up to Carol and being, even though I idolize you, I'm still going to think for myself and I'm not just going to fall in line like, I don't
Sure.
know, anyone else. But
Yeah, I mean it's very good character development for Kamala. I wish there was another way to get there because I do feel like it makes Carol look pretty bad
yeah. Well, and at the
as far as that decision goes.
And at the beginning too, she said like I need somebody who can be a liaison between me, the Inhumans, and this group. So that to me sounds like, well, you just need to, pass messages back and forth, and just if something starts to get out of hand, things have just gotten out of hand. Sorry, I couldn't help it. But let me know right away, and I'll jump in and take care of it. So like
Sure.
at first it sounded like, okay, that makes sense, but then it turned into, well, these people need supervision, and you're going to be their leader. Like, what? Wait, what?
Yeah, I think the idea behind it wasn't necessarily malicious, but the what it ended up being in practice was not a good situation for Kamala to be in.
Yeah.
So, and the racial profiling thing was interesting. I almost wish they explored that a little bit more, but there really wasn't time in this story. And honestly, they debate the implications of the pre-crime thing like ad nauseum in the Civil War book proper. So maybe they didn't need to
Yeah.
devote more time to that here. But it was interesting. Kamala was talking to one of her friends that was darker skinned, and she was like, "Oh, you don't remember the war on crime in the 80s. There's a whole generation of people that went to jail instead of school and all of this, and it is almost like they're assuming ill intent in these criminals, with which several of them do have ill intent, like the Canadian super ninja, whatever they were. They've I mean, they did steal a tank with a maple leaf on it. I can't say this without laughing. I'm sorry.
And it says like, "Oh, Canada" on the missiles.
Yeah,
and,
it does. They did do that. I mean, there were a lot of legitimate crimes that they were stopping, but it's the question that comes up in Minority Report as well. Is this not extremely abusable? And I think Kamala eventually comes to a point where she's like, if humans are running this, there's always going to be human error.
Mhm.
And there's always going to be human bias and things like that. And so her realizing that there basically is no good way to implement this was really interesting. And I thought it was cool that they brought her character on that journey as well, of showing how at first she was just kind of starstruck by her idol asking her to do stuff. And then later on, she starts to feel a little uneasy about it, but she's like, yeah, but Carol's asking me to do it. And then, as the story goes on and eventually one of her friends gets caught up in it and in prison, she's like, wait a minute, what's happening here? So
Yeah, I think this is one of my favorite moments where Kamala, like, in this sort of struggle in her mind to prove that, maybe this isn't such a good thing after all, she actually takes it upon herself to partner with the Ninja Syndicate and stage a fake crime to prove that Ulysses can be wrong with his predictions. Like,
right.
this is a kid coming up with this. All you adults are, arguing over the philosophical ramifications and all of this stuff. But here's a kid that's like, human error. Okay, let me prove it to you. We're going to pretend to blow stuff up. Although they do plant one bomb because, he's like, I can't just not blow anything up. But, nobody gets hurt, so that's fine.
Right.
But it actually,
blows up a car. Yeah.
but it works. Like, they show up because Ulysses is like, oh, there's going to be this huge car bombing thing and it's going to hurt a lot of people, and so the Carol cadets, volunteers, whatever they are, with weird energy plasma suit, show up because they're like, there's a crime that's going to be happening here, and Kamala's like, ha, got you. There's no crime that's going to happen here. I staged this to prove to you that humans can make human mistakes. And I think that was like a huge, like, I don't remember them touching on this in the Civil War II story
No.
or not, but I think this is like a huge win for, Iron Man's side to be like, look, a kid just poked a hole in your whole scheme here, so maybe we need to rethink this.
Right. Just the fact that Iron Man takes the side that he does is a little bit hard for me to believe. I do feel like Iron Man would be the guy spearheading this, especially since he describes himself as a futurist, which I looked up the definition of it. It is one who studies or predicts the future on the basis of current trends. So based on him describing himself as that, it seems like using Ulysses would be like almost the definition of something that he would want to do. So I think that the core conflict is good, but I think a different hero like maybe Captain America or somebody would have been better on the other side of it than Carol, other than Iron Man. And I think they sell it within the story by killing Rhodey, but it was still a little bit hard for me to buy in the event book proper that Tony would take this position.
Yeah,
So
they do give you some reasons, and like the very end where Iron Man's basically incapacitated, Carol and I think it's Beast are actually talking over everything that transpired, because in the end the issue is resolved by Ulysses basically transcends humanity and he joins the cosmic entities, and now he's gone and they can't use his power anymore. So it just
right.
like the situation just disappears, but obviously there's still repercussions, but they're talking over Tony, and they're like, he's a futurist, and so he never lost respect for you, Carol. basically, what he was worried about is, in your hands, he trusts you, so he's not really worried about it. It's who comes after you that could be
Okay.
heading this up, who could turn this into something that could be abused. So that sort of like gave him more motivation, but at the same time, it seemed like, well, why do we need to have a freaking civil war over it? Like, why don't we sit down like adults and
Yeah.
discuss this and come up with a plan that is, rock solid, that we've got the future covered, we've got the present covered, we make sure we're operating within the law, sit down and have a rational discussion, we can work this out. But,
Hmm.
with most movies and TV shows, if they did that, then it would be over within the first like 5 to 10 minutes. So we wouldn't
Right.
have an event to discuss if they had been civil about it instead of civil warring about it.
Instead of worrying about it. It is kind of like that TV trope of like, why is this character not giving me all the information? And the reason is so that there's a story and
Yeah.
a mystery to solve. And it's like that's always frustrating when that happens. I do like Civil War II more than the first one, definitely, because I think the discussion about preventing crime before it happens and all of the different thoughts and perspectives that go into that is really interesting. And I think a discussion worth having. And especially seeing it from Kamala Khan's point of view, this made me like the event more than I did on my first read, because I think that she got into more of the moral issues, and it was really good to see a character go through that journey of just kind of blindly following, but then realizing, maybe that's not the best decision for me. Maybe I should, think for myself, and this doesn't actually sit right with me. And something that I thought of actually was the show Continuum,
Mm-hmm.
sci-fi show that was on several years ago, and how the main character there was very much on the government and the police side of things for like the first, I don't know, like 2 or 3 seasons, until eventually she flips and realizes that like what they're doing is not in the best interests of the people. And so that was just a parallel that I was thinking about while I was reading this story. So
That's one TV trope that really just gets me, is when the bad guys are actually right, but because they are bombing civilians and killing, women and children and doing all this
right.
nefarious stuff, they're the villains and they have to be stopped. But if you just look at their ideology, just from that standpoint, they're actually right. Like there was a problem with the government in Continuum, and there is an
Right.
issue with, this whole Ulysses thing. It needs to be handled very carefully. But since we're not handling it carefully, now we have a civil war on our hands. So
Yeah, we gotta
again, it's
have,
just
it's this happened around the time that that movie was hitting theaters, and from what I understand, it was editorial mandate that they come up with, an event book that was Civil War related at the time. So I did a little bit of reading online about that, and it was something that they kind of hastily put together. But it's funny
yeah.
because I think in a way it's more well thought out than the first time they did Civil War in
Yeah,
the
that's
comics.
interesting. Like it,
It
it was
feels
rushed and there are definitely a few holes in it, but yeah, it feels
mhm,
overall better than the first one that maybe wasn't
yeah.
rushed.
I do feel like though just the character growth for Kamala Khan alone is worth reading this. I don't even know that you need to read the event book to understand this. You're gonna get more context and have a deeper understanding of Carol and Tony's disagreement if you do. But this did a good job of really just putting Miss Marvel front and center, showing what she's about, what drives her, and ultimately has her make the right choice, in a very difficult situation. So
hmm And since
yeah.
they have to explain to her what's happening in the larger event, we as the reader also get that information as well. It's not like you pick up your favorite Ms. Marvel book and you're like, okay, let's turn to issue 7. What's happening today? And she's just completely somewhere else in some weird circumstance and people are dying and you're like, what happened? This really takes you through like, okay, this is what's going on currently in the world. And now you see how she fits into it.
Hmm. Yeah, it was really good. I would basically recommend that anybody that's interested in Civil War II, this tie-in almost feels like necessary. Like you
Yeah.
almost have to read it to get like a fuller context or a richer discussion on the idea of predicting crime and stopping it before it happens, and all of that.
Yeah, honestly, I think this book did a better job of Civil War II than the main Civil War
Yeah,
II did,
I
maybe.
would agree
Like,
with that.
that's funny.
I would agree with that.
So I guess the remaining question would be, how many bananas would you give this?
So really the only thing that bothers me in this story or really sticks in my craw is how I feel like it's kind of damaging to Carol Danvers as a character. I don't particularly like that. I understand that her military background justifies a certain attitude towards crime and, her being tough on it and wanting to prevent stuff before it happened. It all feels somewhat justified. I just really, I wish there was a way to put Kamala in charge without having Carol sort of look manipulative and like a real jerk at the same time. That said, that's really my only gripe with this story. It had a good character arc. It was an event title that even was inclusive enough with the narrative that you didn't need to read the event, which is really not common. So I think this is 4 out of 5 for me. There's not a lot that really pulls it down.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to just agree with you on this one. Like it was well put together. There's a few things you can poke, in it that we sort of did, but really not that much, and nothing that really ruins the story. And if anything, like I said, this is actually a better Civil War II. You need this to read Civil War II, really, but you don't need Civil War II to read this book. So
Right.
I think this is one of those where it didn't necessarily need to be as enjoyable and full as it was, but it did and it delivered, and I think it just shines even more so because it's an event tie-in, and so maybe you sort of write it off, but it actually is a really solid story that even if there wasn't an event going on, you could still read this as part of the Ms. Marvel series, and there's still character growth for her in here, and just in the story itself, in addition to, it looks like some seeds that they're sowing for later stories, and there's a lot to it that's just really good for Ms. Marvel. So yeah, I'm gonna go a solid 4 out of 5 with you on this one.
Yeah. I don't think there's much more to say about it, except this was a really good read. It feels almost like her Uncle Ben moment, as far as like, this is a defining moment in Kamala Khan's history that's going to shape her as a hero moving forward. And I feel like if you're a fan of the character, you kind of have to read this one. So yeah.
And there you have it. Well,
Yeah,
what
there
will
you
we
have it.
have next time?
So next time on We Like Comics, because they have no bones, we'll be looking at Umbrella Academy Apocalypse Suite by Gerard Way and Gabriel Ba.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye, everybody.
Well, bring your umbrellas next time because we're going to school.
That's right.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye bye.
All right. Peace out.
We like
Comics?
because they